Welcome back. We're finishing this series with the weirdest part. The self-experiment, the death stuff, and the argument over whether data can beat instinct. And honestly, the whole thing gets sharper when the personal sacrifice stops being abstract and starts being oatmeal, sleep, and a calendar. That's when it stops sounding like wellness and starts sounding like a full-time religion. Bro, the moment someone says, "I had 6 months of perfect sleep," my brain is already suspicious. 6 months of perfect sleep sounds less human and more like firmware. That's exactly why I'm interested, because if it works, it's almost offensive. The wild part is he's not even selling vibes, he's selling measurement. Right, and the baseline was the first slap in the face. Looking fine outside, not fine inside. Dude, age 60 fitness at 27 is insane. That's not a baseline, that's a warning label. And that's the point, right? People keep confusing appearance with health. Which is annoying because it's such a clean lie we all tell ourselves. Like, if you look successful, you assume the inside must be sorted too. And meanwhile, the body is just quietly filing complaints. The body is basically customer support with no hold music. What I kept hearing underneath everything was that his real enemy was self-deception. And Kate's version was even more relatable because she found out she was people-pleasing herself into bad health. Priority Kate is such a brutal phrase, by the way. That sounds like a corporate wellness initiative that failed immediately. But it's true, she was scheduling everyone else before food, sleep, and literally the bathroom. That's not dedication. That's a hostage situation with a nicer logo. A health hostage, exactly. What hit me is how much of modern life rewards that behavior. If you're always available, always useful, always accommodating, people clap for you. Then your body files for divorce. And Blueprint basically says, no, put your own mask on first, even if your ego hates it. Though let's be honest, a lot of people hear that and immediately think, that's selfish. But the whole argument is that self-care can make you more capable, not less generous. I actually buy that part way more than the perfect sleep part. Yeah, because perfect sleep feels like someone's flexing on the rest of humanity. But the results were not subtle. Better sleep, stronger lifts, better cardio, better blood work. Jumping from the 51st percentile to the top 7% is ridiculous. Normal people do not casually become Olympic spreadsheet goblins in 30 days. Spreadsheet goblins is insane, but yes. Still, the part that matters is the trade-off. The gains came with real sacrifice. No lattes, no spontaneous junk, no weekend drifting, no just guessing. That's the dream, apparently, eating like a robot with a calendar. And the funniest sacrifice was the orange juice with mimosas, because that's how far the routine went. Imagine bringing your own Blueprint meal to brunch while everyone else is emotionally healing through bubbles. But that's also where it gets interesting, because the social cost is real. A lot of people can follow a plan until it starts embarrassing them in public. Or until it asks them to choose sleep over being cool. Cool is expensive, apparently. It's the most expensive currency on earth and everyone's bankrupt. Then there's the pressure piece, which is actually the most human part of this. When people invest in you, it's hard not to turn that into a weird moral obligation. And that's where he says the data saved her from her own performance anxiety. Like her body was asking for a break and her ego was like, absolutely not. That's such a savage internal split. But it shows the core tension. Are you living by evidence or by the need to look committed? Because those are not the same thing, even though people love pretending they are. And that leads right into the bigger philosophical fight. Death, scarcity, and what makes life special. I love that they didn't even fully agree on it because it felt honest. One side is like, yes, death makes life vivid. The other is like, I want the opportunity to live as much as possible. Which is a very clean argument until Bryan comes in with a lighthouse story and makes everybody feel stupid. The lighthouse metaphor was ridiculous and kind of perfect. The whole point is that we keep acting like the captain, like our current mind can bully reality. And then the lighthouse says, no, you are the one who needs to adjust. That hit hard because it's basically saying human intuition is outdated hardware. Which, to be fair, it kind of is. I do think that's the whole Bryan worldview in one sentence. We are too compromised by habit, addiction, sleep loss, and ego to trust our first answer. That's a scary claim, because it means most people think they're choosing freely when they're not. Yeah, and that's why he sounds both inspiring and unbearable at the same time. Inspiring and unbearable is a crazy combo, but accurate. He's basically saying society is drunk, and then he asks why nobody likes his sermon. But I think the criticism misses that he's not only talking about food or sleep. He's talking about identity, future humans, and whether we're even thinking clearly enough to want the right things. That's a huge claim for a guy measuring oxidized LDL at breakfast. Breakfast scientist behavior, honestly. And yet, the wild part is he's built a community around the idea that discipline can be generous. He even seems genuinely entertained by criticism, which is either enlightenment or chaos. Probably a dangerous mixture of both. But I respect that he can read mean tweets and treat them like comedy. That part is actually healthy in a weird way. It suggests the internal voice got worse than the internet, which is a terrifying level of self-awareness. And maybe that's the final lesson of the whole episode. The biggest battle is not public opinion. It's the gap between what you know, what you do, and what you keep excusing, which is annoyingly simple and annoyingly hard. The most dangerous kind of truth is the kind you can't meme away. That's a wrap on the series, and I think the real takeaway is that optimization only matters if it changes who you become. Not just your biomarkers, not just your stats, but your actual decisions when nobody's clapping. And maybe the point is not to become a machine, but to become less distracted by the noise. Also, maybe bring your own lunch to brunch and terrify your friends a little. Honestly, that's the most honest form of friendship. We'll leave it there, and we'll catch you on the next one. Welcome back. This episode is about blueprint, death, and why the lighthouse always wins. And the whole weird tension of getting healthier without turning yourself into a robot. Because Bryan's thing sounds extreme, but the emotional logic is actually pretty simple. Except the simplicity comes with 60 supplements and a full-time job, which is hilarious. Bro, that is not a lifestyle, that is a company. If your brunch needs logistics, you may have gone too far. But that's also why people watch it, because it exposes how chaotic their own habits are. The wild part is he keeps saying the data reveals what ego hides. That's the real punch, right? Not the supplements. Yeah, it's the moment your body tells on your story. Like being told you're 27 and your fitness tests read like you're 70. That would ruin my whole personality in one afternoon. It's actually kinda rude how honest the measurements are. But that's the point. The story of looking fine is not the same as being fine. And that's where the show gets interesting, because Kate becomes the experiment in public. Which is either brave or insane, depending on your sleep score. Honestly, both can be true. She kept hitting that point about people-pleasing, and that hit harder than the blood work. Because she wasn't just saying, I'm busy, she was saying, I don't exist to myself. That's grim, but it's also painfully common. And you can hear the shift when she realizes her own health got scheduled around everyone else's needs. McDonald's at 10 at night is not a moral failure. It is a cry for help. It's also such a specific modern tragedy. And then Blueprint basically says, no, the mask goes on first. Which sounds obvious until you realize how many people treat self-care like a luxury item. Or a vacation activity, which is even worse. Right, like sleep is something you earn after suffering enough. That cultural thing is huge, though, because he's not just talking about health, he's attacking identity. The identity that says being tired means you're important. Yeah, the weird worship of exhaustion as proof of character. Nothing says civilization like bragging about being semi-conscious. That line should honestly be on a billboard. But the death conversation is where it gets unexpectedly tender. Yeah, because they're not really arguing about death, they're arguing about aliveness. Bryan's version is basically, I'm not scared of death, I'm scared of wasting the chance to live. That's actually pretty human. And Kate pushes back in this subtle way like the scarcity makes the moment meaningful. Which is basically the oldest philosophical argument ever, dressed in a hoodie. Dressed in a hoodie and probably measured in blood panels. The interesting part is Bryan doesn't just want longevity, he wants more bandwidth for meaning. And he keeps circling back to the idea that bad habits make your judgment worse. Which is a spicy claim because everyone thinks their own instincts are sacred. Meanwhile, half of us are making decisions on 4 hours of sleep and vibes. Vibes are a terrible executive function. His lighthouse story is the strongest version of that idea. The captain thinks force works, then the lighthouse just exists and ruins his confidence. That's such a brutal metaphor for human self-deception. We keep thinking the world is negotiable, and then reality says no. The whole point is that old tactics like willpower and ego stop working when the environment changes, which is why he's so obsessed with sleep, diet, and recovery as foundations. Or because he likes winning every spreadsheet battle, honestly. No, but that's part of the charm. He is absolutely a spreadsheet man. And yet he's strangely emotional about it, not cold. That's what I found interesting too. He sounds like he's trying to rescue people from their own fog. Even when he talks about the product stack, it's framed like public utility, not just commerce. Although saying your olive oil is a species-level intervention is very on-brand insanity. It is wildly funny to say that with a straight face, and somehow people will still buy the olive oil. Of course they will, because the story is bigger than the bottle. That's the real blueprint trick. It turns personal discipline into a civilizational narrative, which is inspiring but also dangerous if you start believing you're above ordinary life. Yeah, because then the optimization becomes another ego costume. And the best moments in the episode are when that illusion cracks. Like when Kate admits she still wants to live, not just avoid dying. That line is the whole thing for me. Not immortality, just more actual life. That's why the series landed so well, because it was never really about age. It was about attention, honesty, and whether we trust our own minds. And maybe the answer is we trust them a little, but we verify everything. Which is also just a healthier way to live than guessing and suffering. Shocking concept, honestly. The episode also leaves this one big unresolved question, though. Can you improve humans with systems without flattening what makes them human? That's the fear, because optimization people can get creepy fast. There is always one guy who turns wellness into a cult with better lighting. Better lighting and cleaner fonts, which is terrifying. But the cleaner argument here is that better sleep makes you less reactive, not less human. Maybe it makes you more available to your actual self. And maybe that's what all this was pointing at from the start. Anyway, that's the final pass on this one, and I think the takeaway is simple. Better habits matter because they change who gets to make the decisions. And if the future is a lighthouse, you probably want your eyes open when you reach it. We'll leave it there before we turn the olive oil into a constitution. Thanks for listening to the full series, and we'll catch you on the next one. Welcome back. This one goes deep into blueprint, death, and that lighthouse problem. By the end, it feels less like biohacking and more like arguing with reality itself. And honestly, that is where the whole thing gets interesting. Because at some point, the sleep routine stops being the headline. It becomes a full-on philosophy of what kind of human should be in charge. The wild part is how strict it gets, like the same food every day, fixed calories, all of it. That is not a lifestyle. That is a hostage negotiation with your own preferences. Bro, 700 calories and 60 supplements is not casual self-care. That is a software update with pills. But the logic underneath it is pretty clean. Measure, intervene, measure again, and stop trusting vibes. Which, by the way, is offensive to a lot of people who love their vibes. Especially the people who think being tired is part of their personality. The baseline test was the real slap, though. Age 60 or 70 on fitness? That is the nightmare of modern life right there. You can look fine and still be a mess underneath. That's the uncomfortable part, because it takes away the excuse of appearances. Everyone loves saying, I look healthy, I'm probably healthy. The body was basically like, nice try. And then the data shows oxidized LDL and suddenly the joke is over. That part matters because it is not cosmetic, it is early warning. This is what I keep coming back to. Are we just bad at seeing ourselves? Or are we emotionally committed to not seeing ourselves? Because looking at the truth is annoying when the truth says, go to bed. And then there is Kate, who is the real surprise of the whole story. She did not just do the program, she got dragged into her own blind spots. The existential crisis updates were insane, like, hope your meltdown is going well today. That is darkly funny, but also kind of affectionate. What I liked is that she did not pretend to be tougher than she was. That openness made the whole thing feel more real. And she names the thing most people never admit, people-pleasing. Like your calendar can become a moral failure if you never leave space for yourself. Back-to-back meetings, no food, no bathroom, then McDonald's at 10. That is not wellness, that is urban survival. And the twist is that caring for yourself makes you better at helping others. That airplane mask analogy is corny until it is true. People hate it because it sounds selfish before it sounds smart. But then the social sacrifice thing gets messy, because it is not just discipline. It is missing brunch drinks, missing weekends, missing the easy version of yourself. Also, apparently artisanal milk lattes, which is such a devastating loss. The pain is small, but the accumulation is what gets you. That is the actual sacrifice, not some cinematic moment. It is 1,000 tiny no's to get one bigger yes. And then the heart rate scene, that was the best example of the whole psychology. Because the body was asking for a break, and the ego was asking for an audience. That is such a brutal sentence, but it feels accurate. She literally had a metric telling her to stop, and the pressure made her push harder. That is how people destroy themselves while trying to look impressive. And Bryan's point there is actually good. Data only works if you obey it. Otherwise, it just becomes another costume for your insecurity. Which leads into the death conversation, because that got way more honest than expected. I thought that was one of the more human moments in the whole exchange. The idea is not to be scared of death, but to protect the opportunity to live. And there is a difference there that people flatten way too fast. One of them sounds like a slogan, the other sounds like a person. I also like the point that scarcity is what makes life feel valuable. If everything was endless, a lot of meaning would evaporate. But then Bryan goes full cosmic and says we may not even know how to want properly. That is where he loses the room and also kind of wins it. Because he says the quiet part loudly, that we may be too compromised to trust ourselves. That is a scary claim, but not a stupid one. If you are sleep-deprived, addicted, overstimulated, and fried, how good is your judgment? Probably not elite, let us be honest. So his argument is basically that lifestyle is epistemology. The way you live changes what you are even able to know. That is a scary thought for anyone who thinks chaos is a personality. And then the lighthouse metaphor is the whole thing in one image. We think we are the fleet commander, but sometimes reality is just a lighthouse. Meaning, your authority does not matter if you are headed toward a rock. You can yell all you want, the lighthouse is not negotiating. That is how he sees the future too, as a new system with new rules. And honestly, that is either visionary or delusional depending on your mood, which is probably why he is so interesting to listen to. He is not just optimizing himself, he is trying to optimize the species. That is where the humanitarian frame comes from, even if it sounds absurd at first. Lunchbox for humanity is such a ridiculous phrase, but I get it. He wants to hand people the basics and say, go live well. And to his credit, he is also making the recipes and protocols free. That part matters, because it changes the project from private obsession to public argument. It stops being about one guy and becomes a question for everybody. Even if the products and supplements make some people roll their eyes. Especially then, honestly. The money detail was also wild, because 3 to 4 million on measurement is no joke. That is a huge amount of money just to figure out what your body is doing. But that is kind of the entire thesis. Expensive discovery first, cheap implementation later. Or expensive obsession first, depending on your level of patience. Fair, that is the honest counter-argument. But the most revealing part for me was the community response. He seems genuinely moved when people are kind instead of cruel. That matters because it shows he is not numb to everything. And then he turns around and enjoys mean tweets like a child with candy. Which is hilarious because the more serious he gets, the more unserious he is about insults. That is probably healthy in its own weird way. If you have already been harsher to yourself than anyone else can be, you are free. That is a brutal kind of freedom, but it is freedom. So the final takeaway is not just sleep better or eat better. It is that the person making your choices might need upgrading. Which is an insane sentence, but here we are. And maybe that is the real end of the series, not the protocol, but the self behind it. Because once you start asking who is deciding, everything changes. Anyway, that is the close-on blueprint, death, and the lighthouse problem. We went from calories and supplements to what it means to trust your own mind. Honestly, not bad for a final episode. Thanks for staying with us through the whole series, and we will see you next time. Welcome back. This one is about blueprint, death, and the lighthouse problem. We start with sleep and end up asking whether our minds can even be trusted. That is a ridiculous distance to travel in one conversation. But the wild part is he is serious about all of it. Like perfect sleep, fixed nutrition, 60 supplements, and then somehow more clarity. Most people hear that and think cult, not calendar. What gets me is the data versus self-story thing. He keeps saying the outside can look fine while the inside is a mess. Which is rude because that applies to half the internet. And probably half of us before coffee. But he is making a bigger claim too, that your judgments are distorted when you are unhealthy. That is where people get annoyed because it sounds like he is calling everyone sleepy and wrong. Which, to be fair, is a very funny accusation. Yet the lighthouse story lands because sometimes you are not arguing with a person. You are arguing with reality, and reality does not care about your ego. That lighthouse analogy is almost unfairly good. The captain can shout all he wants, and the rocks are still there. So the whole point becomes humbling yourself before the data. Not your vibe, not your identity, not your excuses. People hate that because excuses are emotionally delicious. That is the most accurate thing said in this whole series. Then there is the death piece, which is surprisingly not grim with him. He is basically saying mortality makes the moment matter more. And honestly, that is hard to argue with. Not because it is profound, but because it is obvious once you hear it. Which is the best kind of profound. Exactly, the annoying kind that should have been obvious earlier. What I liked most is that the whole thing is not really about living forever. It is about whether you are using the time you actually have well. That is a much better question than chasing immortality fantasies. And then the community piece matters too, because he is basically building a public experiment. Recipes, supplements, training, all of it opened up like a blueprint. The name is almost too on the nose, but it works. The weirdest part is how much of it becomes a moral argument. Like if sleep and nutrition make you clearer, then neglect starts looking like a choice. And people do not love being told their chaos is optional. Nobody wants their lifestyle called a software bug. Still, that is the series in one line. Better self-management, it might be the most human revolution we have left. That is a wrap on the final episode, and it has been a wild one. We went from sleep trackers to existential dread, which feels about right. Thanks for sticking with us through the whole series. We will see you next time.